Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and I just got back from the new film, The Selfish Giant. It's a new film by Cleo Barnard, who directed a documentary I quite like called The Arbor, and I thought it was probably one of the best documentaries I've seen in probably the past 10 years. It's just an amazing documentary, and it really brought into question a lot of what I had seen about documentaries. And when I found out that she had made a feature fictional film, I was interested. And I was curious because a lot of documentarians can't really make that transition. And I think it's also hard because you're basically becoming a different director. It's really hard to be the same director you were as a documentarian that you are in a feature film. At first, when I was watching it, that seemed a little odd for me because I kind of set myself up in seeing this based on her previous work, although there are similarities, certainly, especially where it's set, which is actually the same neighborhood almost, or same area that The Arbor is set in, although it's a very different time period. These two young boys, Arbor and Swifty, who are great mates and they hang out all the time and they're like kind of juvenile delinquents in school. And Arbor's the real troublemaker. He doesn't respect his teachers. They have a hard time dealing with him in school, and they don't really know what to do with him. His parents, they can't control him. Swifty's a little more responsible and always hangs out with Arbor. I feel like Arbor's more the instigator and Swifty just follows him around. But after they're kind of expelled from school, although Swifty's pretty much suspended, they have a different term for it in the film, which I forget. Arbor basically decides he's going to work for this scrap metal guy called Kitten, and he just kind of goes around collecting scrap metal as much as he can find. If he can steal any from the electric company, he will. Swifty, however, gets more involved in this weird horse racing thing, which apparently is like real in England, but I'd never heard of it before I'd seen this film, where they kind of race horses on the streets and there's like cars drive around them and yell at the people riding these horses. And Swifty is really good with horses and is able to tell like if, you know, they're treating them wrong or have the reins too tight or anything like that. He instantly knows. He knows horses very well. And he knows how to kind of talk to animals very well. They're kind of moving in different directions as they're kind of off from school for a little bit and trying to grow up in this society. This is a modern adaptation, they say. It's kind of more based on the Oscar Wilde short story, The Selfish Giant. And that story is about a giant who has this world and like won't let the children in and like won't help them. And I think this film has a little to do with that in a little bit of a way, because I feel like this film is really about these kids who society or schooling can't really help them. And they say even in the film that the character of Arbor, mainstream schooling won't apply for him, but they don't really give an alternative. They don't say mainstream school doesn't apply to him, so take him here. They just don't, that part isn't there. It's just like mainstream schooling doesn't apply to him, so you're fucked. I don't know what to do. And his mom is kind of like just screwed. I mean, they have no money, they have no resources to do anything with him. I'm not sure if what she's trying to say with this film is that the selfish giant is society itself, or who the selfish giant is. That might be a little too heavy, and I almost feel like, much like The Arbor, I need to watch this again. One of the interesting things I was thinking about with this film is, first off, it's so different from The Arbor. If you told me it was a different director, I'd believe it. But it's still an incredibly strong film. It reminds me of stuff like Fish Tank, which came out a couple years ago. One director it reminds me a lot of is Steve McQueen. Not essentially like that it's like a Steve McQueen movie, in some ways, but the way I'm kind of comparing it to Steve McQueen is I've always felt like Steve McQueen, basically what Steve McQueen does is he is basically like a prestige studio director working in the independent film world, and he basically makes like prestige movies, whether it's 12 Years a Slave or Shame, a message picture, Shame, or 12 Years a Slave is like a prestige picture, and then he just kind of shoots it like an independent film. And I felt like The Selfish Giant is more done like a 30s or 40s film. It reminded me a lot of like Wild Boys of the Road, which obviously I am a fan of that film quite a bit. It felt like more in that vein where it's kind of a subtler, simpler story in a lot of ways, but it was a lot to literature, more so than you see in current Hollywood or current films. It has kind of a classic storytelling sense to it. I was kind of just really excited by it after a while. Like, it took me a while to kind of get into it because it felt like one of her films, but it didn't. Eventually, I kind of got around to really loving it and really falling in love with these characters and following these characters. And I think when you make such a kind of simple, more of a modest story about just like these two kids, I think when you make a kid's film and make it like you're like kind of talking down to kids, that never works. And I think one of the things that's really great about this film is this film works on just a pure storytelling angle, as well as it's not like like talking down to the kid characters. It really respects them. It definitely took me back to both being a kid and seeing kids who were like that, but it also gave it kind of a classic sense about it. And it also, there's a lot of desperation in this film, and I know some people have commented in other reviews that this is like the most miserable of all like miserable English movies. I never felt that way about it. I never felt it got too down on itself, really. I mean, it did seem like their families' lives were pretty terrible. I haven't seen a film about the poor done in such a depressing way and kind of a necessity way, the way Selfish Giant does. It really felt like this was more realistic than excessive to me. Cleo Barnard, whose name I'm probably butchering, I think has really become one of the best English directors, probably one of the best directors around right now, who just people aren't really noticing, unfortunately. But she's come out with 2 incredibly strong films. It says a lot about her as a storyteller, that she can make something as experimental and different of a documentary as The Arbor was, and then make such a simple, kind of modest, stripped down, very economical film, the way Selfish Giant is. And she's kind of one of the few directors who, I'm not sure what she's going to do next at this point. I hope she does something just as ambitious as these 2 films have been, and frankly, just as good and as interesting. I know the 2 child actors were like non-actors. They weren't actors before this, Connor Chapman and Sean Thomas, and they're both just exceptionally good. Like some of the better kid actors I've seen. Almost have that Battle of Algiers quality to it. I don't know what their lives were like before they made this or anything, but it had that kind of a real reality sense to it. It didn't feel as much like a movie or anything. It's such an amazing movie, but it's also a movie that after I watched it, much like The Arbor, I have to almost watch it again. Like I have to really dig deep into it. And as much as it feels economical and simple in its storytelling, it does feel like there's a lot more going on that would take a few viewings to watch. And I've heard people compare it to things like Lynn Ramsey and her film Ratcatcher and Ken Loach. There's certain moments that I'm not really going to forget, and it's hard to forget characters like Swifty and Arbor. And it reminds me of like kind of that pre-code era, just the honesty to it. So if you have seen The Selfish Giant and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.